Fantasy Brains!
Welcome in to another episode of the Fantasy Brains podcast, bringing you the 32-team episode. I don't even know what episode we're on at this point, but we are featuring the Las Vegas Raiders today, a team that has a lot of new pieces on offense. You have a new quarterback, you have a brand new shiny running back from the NFL draft, and then you have two rookie receivers as well from day 2 and 3 of the NFL draft. So a lot to talk about with today's episode, because a lot of people are high on the Raiders and a lot of people are also low on them. So I think it's definitely going to be nice to debunk some of, the social media opinions and really dive into how this offense is actually going to score and whether or not they're going to be a productive team this year for fantasy football. So like I said, welcome into this episode. If you've been with us for the first 18 and 19 episodes of this series, you know the drill. We're going to be filling out the entirety of this whiteboard to my right. We'll start off looking at how the team looked like last year compared to this year. Then we'll move on to our projections for the season. We'll look at some other varying factors such as strength of schedule, as well as their fantasy playoff schedule when it comes to they're playing in a dome, they're playing in cold weather, warm weather, whatever it might be. And then just checking out some extra storylines that could change the course of the season. So let's just get right into it. Like I mentioned, they have a completely new team. And aside from just players itself, you have a brand new coaching staff. You have Pete Carroll coming in, going to be the new head coach of this team. We all know what Pete Carroll did in Seattle, Super Bowl champion, had a really good team for a while. Russell Wilson was a top fantasy quarterback for many years of his career. We've seen Geno have a couple good years with Pete Carroll, and I think, that's why Pete Carroll decided to go out there with the Raiders quarterback situation and bring in Geno Smith. And then, before we do get to Smith and his outlook, they also bring in Chip Kelly, who was the offensive coordinator at Ohio State. And so now he becomes the offensive coordinator at the Las Vegas Raiders. And so it's going to be a little bit of an interesting jump to see what Kelly's going to really draw up comparatively to playing with such high talent at Ohio State and playing at the college level, and now coming over to the NFL with considerably less talent compared to the rest of the league, and then also switching to kind of that NFL play style. So definitely interested to see with the Raiders. Again, I think this is probably the hardest team to predict this year because they do have some names that excite you on the offensive side of the ball. So last year with the Raiders, you have Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell as your starting quarterbacks, kind of flip-flopping throughout the season. Now you bring in Geno Smith. Now, Geno Smith is one of those guys that you'll have a couple analysts out there putting him in the top 10 to 12 quarterbacks and saying that, the Seattle Seahawks offensive line was what was holding him back. He made a lot of plays that he didn't necessarily get credit for. And I can kind of get behind some of that narrative. I think Geno is definitely a respectable quarterback. I think that he deserves to be in that range of quarterbacks that should be starting in the NFL. Now, do I think I'd consider putting him top 10 to 12? Probably not. But I do think that he can provide good fantasy outlook, which is what this entire video is going to be about. So when you look at Geno last year, he had 4,300 passing yards, 22 total touchdowns, and 15 picks. So himself, it's not looking that great because he's not going to have a lot of touchdowns. This Raiders offense probably isn't going to score a lot of points. But Geno Smith's thrown for 4,000 plus yards, which he also did 2 years ago. And even last year, he threw for 3,700 yards. If he's going to be throwing for a ton of yards, that looks great for the running backs, the receivers, and the tight ends on this team in terms of how productive this offense is going to be. But in terms of Geno's standalone value, I think that's where it kind of halts a little bit because he does have a turnover issue and he also doesn't score as many touchdowns. So I think when you combine that with the lack of rushing upside he has, that's why you're going to find him towards the bottom of the quarterback rankings. They draft Ashton Jeanty, 6th overall. He is going to be the only running back on this team that, we really care about. And I was not a fan of this pick in real life. I don't think that it's what the Raiders needed. I think they had a lot of holes. They have one of the worst defenses in the NFL, if not the worst. And they went out and decided to pick a running back. So at the end of the day, knowing that they had all these other needs and they still picked a running back just shows how good Ashton Jeanty is and shows how highly they think of him. So, he comes in, one of the top running back prospects we've seen in a while. Last year at Boise State, Heisman candidate at the end of the season, 2,700 total yards, 30 total touchdowns, 23 catches as well on 7.0 yards per carry. So, he did it all last year. He was the most unstoppable player in college football. And you can't really hate what he did in college and then say it's not going to, translate to the NFL here. And I think that it's going to be, the game script is going to be the biggest thing for Ashton Jeanty this year. How Are the Raiders going to be losing these games early on? Are they going to, get game scripted out of running the ball? But Genty has proven in practice through training camp as well that, all the signs are looking great. He's exactly what they envisioned when drafting him. And, they got a couple other running backs on this team. You have Raheem Mostert. You still have Dylan Laube as well. But those guys are never going to have value unless Genty is hurt. And I think the good thing about Genty that you can say he has comparatively to other running backs is that he is going to probably play around 85% of the snaps on offense, which majority of other running backs are going to be in a time split. Even the top guys, such as like Jahmyr Gibbs, like you're only going to probably see him play around 60% of snaps. But a guy like Genty is going to play in probably the top 5 league snaps when it comes to running backs. The receiver core is very mediocre. There's one guy I really do like. When we get to the projections, you'll kind of see why I like him so much. But Jakobi Meyers is going to be the top guy. He's going to be their slot receiver. Had 87 catches for 1,000 yards and 4 touchdowns last year. Meyers has been one of those guys that is just not a big name at all, so he never gets any recognition. But he's had a couple seasons in a row where he's been a top 25 receiver, and yet every year he gets drafted outside the top 30 receivers. So I think Meyers is going to be that guy that you can be confident in with this offense that isn't, Brock Bowers or Ashton Genty. He's the only receiver that has a lot of reps under him. He's going to be a reliable target, and I think that he could get a lot of volume in this offense when we get to the projection side. But he's going to be the slot receiver. And then when it comes to the outside receivers, this is where it all kind of gets a little bit muddy. You have Trey Tucker, who most people honestly don't even know. 47 catches for a little bit over 500 yards and 4 touchdowns last year. He's just the second best receiver on this team that isn't a rookie. And so you have to figure that because, the rookies on this team might not play a lot at the beginning of the season, that Tucker will get his chance to shine and be the second receiver on this team. Now, I don't think Trey Tucker's anything special. I don't think he's worth drafting, but he right now is going to be a starter according to the depth chart. So we do have to highlight him in that regard. And maybe he puts together a couple decent weeks for your best ball leagues. I think that's probably the best format to draft him in those rounds 17 and 18. You have 2 rookies. I'm going to mention Dante Thornton first, even though he was drafted later than Jack Bech. And that's because Thornton, round 4 pick from Tennessee, been getting snaps with the ones. He is ahead of Bech on the depth chart. And the reality is with Thornton, he didn't really do much in college. His best year was 2024. He had 600 yards and 6 touchdowns. So he didn't have any college production whatsoever. But he's a huge receiver, very good deep threat. I think that, he's your big play, your highlight reel player on this team, going to be the guy to stretch the field. So I don't think he has too much standalone value in your regular redraft leagues, but I do like his value in best ball as he could catch a 75-yard touchdown, any week. And it does look like that he is going to be on the field a lot because there have been reports that his blocking has looked good as well. But then you look at Jack Bech, who's going to be the other receiver fighting for snaps, round 2 pick out of TCU. 62 catches for 1,000 yards last year, along with 9 touchdowns. So Bech was a player that was very love or hate coming into the draft process this year. And reports just have not been that good about him. It looks like he's not adjusting as well as people might have hoped to the NFL level. And so I think with Bech, the fact that he goes second round and yet he's behind Thornton on the depth chart is never a good sign. So I think if you want to stash a guy in Dynasty, I think Bech is a good guy to stash. But he's just not going to provide any of that standalone value in your regular redraft leagues. You're never going to have a situation where you keep him on your bench. He's going to be in the low 80s, low 90s of receivers and not going to be relevant unless he puts together a couple good weeks, and then you can pick him up on the waiver wire. Looking at the tight end, I mean, this is the highlight of the team right here. Brock Bowers having an absolutely unbelievable rookie year. One of my favorite prospects. I comped him last year as a combination of George Kittle with a hint of Jonnu Smith. And that's kind of looked exactly what he was last year. 112 catches for 1,200 yards and 5 touchdowns. Now, it's hard to kind of expect Bowers to have a better season last year because they added Genty. They added some other receivers. They have a new coach, new play caller. They are still going to be playing from behind for the most part, but you have to assume with Bowers that he's not going to do much better than he did last year. But that's not bad at all because he had such an insane year last year. And this guy is going to be such a safe pick for a top 3 tight end. He's extremely talented. The game script is going to be in his favor. And so I think he's going to be a guy that I'm not even going to talk about that much this episode, but the reason I'm not going to talk about him as much is because there's nothing really negative or controversial to say about him. It's more just, take him when he's getting drafted and he'll provide that value. But let's get on to the projections here. I got this team passing for a little bit under 3,500 passing yards. So I think Geno Smith, 3,500 yards is going to be lower than the last 3 years that he's done or, had in the NFL. But I do think that the Raiders are going to be try to be a little bit more run heavy with Ashton Jeanty than the Seahawks were when Geno was the starter there. And so you have 3,500 passing yards, 23 touchdowns for Geno. Probably going to throw in around 11 to 12 picks there as well. I got him as my quarterback 25, and he goes as the quarterback 26. So I do think he is a very good value in super flex leagues. I think he's kind of towards the tail end of not good starters, but guys that you're comfortable starting, when you get around him and Bryce Young and Cam Ward, JJ McCarthy, Penix, in that range of players. I think he is, might be the end of that tier, but he's kind of one of those last quarterbacks that I'm okay with getting as my second quarterback in a super flex league this year. So I think with Geno, he has no rushing upside, but he has a high floor. The Raiders are going to be playing from behind. They're going to let him throw the ball a ton. And so he could get a ton of yards, maybe throw some picks, but I think he'll be a safe bet to score you around, 14 to 16 points every week, which, if your quarterback gets injured, or again, if you're playing in a super flex league, if you're getting him that late, I think the value is there. And so, when we're projecting players on this team, there's really not that many guys that are fantasy relevant. But one of the fantasy relevant guys, obviously, is Ashton Jeanty. I got Jeanty having a monster season. I have him projected for 1,350 rush yards and 12 rushing touchdowns. And I also have him projected for 37 catches for a little bit south of 400 receiving yards and another touchdown. So I think Jeanty will have a monster season. I love his durability as a player, what he was able to do last year. I think one thing that's been underrated about Jeanty is his receiving ability, just because they just didn't utilize him in that way at Boise State. But again, reports out of training camp have been that Jeanty looks great as a receiver, been being used in a lot of different ways out of the backfield. And I think that's the best thing about a player like Jeanty, is that you have a very durable player. He's young, doesn't have a lot of touches on his belt, and they're going to feed him the ball. And so when you combine that with the high draft capital, knowing at how high they value him, I feel very safe about Ashton Jeanty. So I actually have him as my running back 4, and I would put him over Christian McCaffrey and Devon Achane and Derrick Henry, even though he's going as the running back 6 right now. And I think that for me, he just feels a lot safer than those players. I feel safer when it comes to his injury risk. I feel safer when it comes to the amount of touches that he's going to get on the season. And maybe those touches aren't as valuable because the Raiders' offensive line is average at best, and they might be losing games, which means the game script isn't there. But I trust the talent of the player. I trust the draft capital, and I trust the volume that he's going to get, that he might be a guy that gets you 15 to 16 carries for 60 yards and a touchdown. And then he also gets you 4 catches for another 20 yards. And while that seems kind of mid, that'll put together around a 19 to 20 point performance. And that's, I think his floor every single week, obviously without the touchdown, but I think around 15 carries and 3 to 4 catches is what you're going to be expecting out of him, which you could say the same for some of these other running backs in that range. But I just like the durability and the volume that Jeanty is going to get over some of those other guys. So Jeanty, I think that, I expect him 50 plus catches on the year. I think that Jeanty is going to be a very safe option towards the end of the first. And when you're in your redraft leagues right now, the end of the first is probably the worst spot to draft right now, or mid to the end of the first. So you're not getting a superstar player anyways. I think Jeanty is your best bet. Looking at the receivers, again, I mentioned it, Trey Tucker, Jack Bech, Dante Thornton. I don't think any of those guys are viable players. I would not draft any of them in a redraft league. I think they are good flyers in best ball. If you draft Geno Smith, it's a good stacking option. I think if you want to stash those guys in Dynasty, I don't mind it. They're rookie players. But in terms of redraft, these guys do not have any value. The only guy that I really do like is Jakobi Meyers. And he is one of my biggest steals this year in drafts. Again, 3 straight seasons as a top 25 fantasy receiver. Yet right now he is going as the receiver 39. His quarterback play improved from last year. Geno Smith comes in again, 3 straight seasons with 3,600 plus passing yards. And on top of that, Geno Smith absolutely loves the slot. look at what JSN did last year, and a lot of people could argue that JSN is the most talented receiver on that Seattle team, which may be true, but he targets the slot so consistently, and that's why I think, Myers and Bowers are going to eat in this offense. The Raiders are going to be playing from behind. He's going to be getting a ton of volume. So I got him finishing inside my top 30 receivers. I wouldn't be surprised if Myers was an 85 plus catch candidate. I got Myers going for 92 catches for a little bit under 900 yards and 4 touchdowns. So I don't even think he's going to score a lot of touchdowns or have a huge yardage amount, but I think he's going to get fed the ball. And I think that, volume is key, or volume is king in PPR. And I think that Myers can be a very high floor option to be your flex in your redraft league. So if you draft, a player like Devon Achane first round, and Devon Achane could be kind of a boomer bust player as an early round pick, I like Myers as being a high floor, low ceiling player that can get you around 10 to 15, maybe 10 to 20 points every single week, which isn't bad if he's your flex or first player coming off the bench. So love Myers. I think you should try to target him. He's going at the end of that kind of wide receiver 3, early wide receiver 4 range, and I think he is going to be a good player on this team. And then when you look at Brock Bowers, I got Bowers having a very similar season as last year. I think he'll go for 96 catches, 970 yards, and 7 touchdowns. So I think the touchdowns go up a little bit, but I think the yardage does go down. And obviously, these are all projections. These are all statted out. So I do think that he could easily hit the 1,000-yard mark. But with the added weapons, with Ashton Jeanty, I do think that the ball could be spread out a little bit more. And the Raiders defense does look a little bit worse this year than it did last year, which means that ball control for the other team could become a factor this year. And a lot of people out there are not going to necessarily understand that. But when I say that, I'm saying, while the Raiders game script looks positive for the receivers and the tight ends because they're going to be losing, they're going to have to come from behind, you might also have such a bad defense that teams are going to be able to have 6 to 7 minute drives consistently on this Raiders team. And it's just going to prevent the Raiders offense from being on the field. And then, how productive is this offense going to be when they are on the field? Are they going to be able to consistently get first downs? And that's where the question mark comes, is what's the ball control going to look like? And so I think with Bowers, like I mentioned, he's my tight end 1. He's going as a tight end 1. There's really nothing you can say that's negative about him. He's already probably the best tight end in the league, either him or George Kittle. And his quarterback play improved. The offense should be better than it was last year. So I think we can expect better efficiency, but maybe less volume than he had last year with the added weapons. But definitely, I think, second round Brock Bowers is a great value, especially if you're in a 10-man league. I think getting a positional advantage at the tight end position is so key this year in drafts. So I kind of mentioned it, with that game script. How does this kind of look for the strength of schedule? So for quarterbacks, they have the 15th easiest schedule, so right in the middle of the pack. And then also for receivers, they have the 4th easiest. So it looks like they might be playing some weaker secondaries this year, which makes sense. They're going to be playing a 4th place schedule from the AFC West, but they're also going to be playing the Broncos twice, the Chiefs twice, and the Chargers twice, which are all going to be relatively tough matchups, at least the Chiefs and Broncos on the defensive side of the ball. So the good thing is, though, is that when you have the 15th easiest for quarterbacks, 4th easiest for receivers, is that hopefully Geno will be able to complete a lot of passes and be able to move the ball down the field, even if it doesn't result in wins for this Raiders team. They have the 8th hardest schedule for running backs, but I think no matter what schedule they would have, I would still be just as confident in Jeanty. I think that regardless, the volume is going to be there, and you're going to have some weeks where he has a really good game and some weeks where he only scores, 10 points. And that's okay, because even 10 points, while it doesn't seem good, that's a lot better than 2 or 3 points, which is the floor of a lot of other players that could be going in that range, or, even in the second round. And so I think with Jeanty, you're going to know that you're getting at least 20 touches a game, which is exactly why this 8th hardest schedule doesn't affect me too much when it comes to drafting him compared to other guys in that range. And then tight end, they have the 3rd hardest, but Brock Bowers matchup proof. There's never a situation where you're going to be sitting him, so it doesn't matter at all. You're starting him every week, no matter who they play. And their playoff schedule does not look great, but they don't play anyone in their division. So week 15, they play in Philadelphia, which is going to be a brutal matchup. It looks like you're probably going to be sitting everyone except for Bowers and Jeanty, just because those are first and second rounders. But everyone else on this team is probably a sit. Same with week 16 against the Texans. And then week 17, they're at home, but it's against the Giants, which is the Giants have a really good defense as well. So this is not a good playoff schedule for this Raiders team. I am most likely going to stay away from these Raiders players. Now, I mentioned it. I really do like Myers. I do like Genty. I like Bowers. And so I think that those guys are all good. At least Genty and Bowers are at their prices. But I'm not really going out of my way to reach on these players. If I had the 10th pick, I'm not going to take Bowers at the first pick of the second round. I would take him kind of after that tier of elite running backs, elite receivers, because I do think he is an elite player, but you do have to look into the regression a little bit and say, is Brock Bowers going to have 112 catches again? Probably not, if we're being honest here. And so I think with this playoff schedule, it looks kind of bad for the best ball users out there, or even the redraft users who, are pretty much monetizing for that weeks 15, 16, 17 when they do make the playoffs. But with Bowers, with Genty, those guys are matchup proof anyway, so you're always going to start them. Myers is going to be the one that we're not really going to know until what we see out of him in the season of whether or not to start him those weeks. But those matchups are probably bottom tier for typically what I've seen when I've been doing these teams. And I think just to kind of cap it off, what is this team going to look like? What are some storylines that could change the stance of the season? Is their defense going to be as bad as that 2024 Cincy team? Because this Raiders defense, outside of Max Crosby, I mean, there is little to no notable players on this team. And so that's kind of what I compared to Cincy, is that Cincy has Trey Hendrickson last year, and he had, 18 sacks, and they were still god-awful. So I'm kind of worried that it's going to be the same thing. And that could be good for the offense because it means that they're just going to have to throw the ball all game and that Geno Smith could easily have 4,200 pass yards. But I am worried that they're just going to get ran off the field the entire game and that they're not going to get the opportunities that you might get from some of these other offenses. I am also very curious to see how the receiver snap shares work out and how the O-line snap shares work out. This offensive line is very unproven, similarly to these receivers. And when you have a new coaching staff coming in, there's a lot of question marks on who's going to play. And that's the deal with the Raiders, is there's so many new pieces. There's a brand new staff that it's really hard to judge how good they're going to be this year and what their team actually is going to look like come the season. So I think with the Raiders, you bet on the players that are, you draft the players that are going to be elite. And I think you make that consolidated opinion that you're going to draft elite players hoping that they're going to give you elite production. And that's the hope with guys like Genty and Brock Bowers. And that's the reason to draft them, even if this Raiders offense isn't that great. That's going to conclude this episode of the 32 team series. Hopefully you all enjoyed this episode with the Las Vegas Raiders. We're going to be concluding the AFC West in our next episode with the Denver Broncos, who are going to be a very fun team to talk about. Very excited to talk about my favorite tight end in fantasy football in that episode. But make sure to follow us on all of our social medias. Definitely hit the subscribe button on YouTube and leave us a comment on what else you'd like to see in our next video and what you really liked in this video. And just in general, your opinions on these takes and whether or not you see these things happening this year. But thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll see you next time. We're out.
3, 2, 1.
Got a blast.
Thanks for checking out the Fantasy Brains. Don't miss next week's episode, Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern. See you next week, Brainiacs.